They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. The Thailic Empire had a saying. It translated roughly as, "The loud ones are dangerous, but the quiet ones are already done." They forgot that saying. That was their first mistake. On the planet Durathroman 4, there was a human named Noah. She was not a soldier. She was not a diplomat. She ran a small repair shop in the lower district of the planet's only real city, a place called Cathari, where the buildings were old stone and the streets smelled like engine oil and fried grain. She fixed things: ships, machines, power converters, the occasional Thailic vehicle when their own mechanics were too proud to admit they could not figure out the problem. She had been on Durathroman 4 for 6 years. She spoke 3 local dialects. She knew the names of her neighbors' children. She knew which street vendor made the best fried grain wraps and which one used cheaper oil and would give you a stomachache if you were not careful. Durathroman 4 was not a human world. Humans had no claim to it politically or legally. But about 400 humans had drifted here over the years, same as they drifted everywhere, drawn by work or curiosity or the specific human need to go somewhere new and see what happened. The Thailic tolerated them the way you tolerate a type of bird that shows up in your garden every season. Harmless, slightly odd, not worth thinking about too hard. The Thailic Empire was large. 12 systems under direct control, another 8 under what they called administrative guidance, which was a polished phrase for "we took your resources and left you the bones." They were old and organized, and they moved through the galaxy with the confidence of something that had never been told no in a very long time. Noah's shop was between a fabric merchant and a water purification supply store. On the morning that things changed, she was in the back room with her hands inside a broken atmospheric processor, trying to find the fault in the secondary coil when she heard something outside. She did not think much of it at first. Cathari was noisy. Street arguments, vendor calls, the low rumble of cargo vehicles. Then she heard a different sound, the kind that does not belong. She came out of the back room, still holding her tools. Across the street, 3 Thailic soldiers in the dark green uniforms of the Empire's Resource Extraction Division were pulling an old Durath man out of his home. His name was Peth. He was 70 years old and walked with a cane, and had been living in that house since before Noah arrived on this planet. His house sat on ground that the Thailic had apparently decided was needed for a new processing facility. He had been given a notice 3 days ago. The notice said vacate. He had gone to the district office to ask about compensation. The district office had given him a second notice that said vacate faster. Now they were pulling him into the street. His daughter was screaming from the doorway. 2 of his grandchildren were standing behind her, small faces watching from the frame. The street had gone quiet. Durath locals stood along the edges, watching, the careful stillness of people who had learned that watching was safer than doing. Noah stood in the doorway of her shop. She still had the repair tool in her hand. It was a long, flat instrument with a rubber grip, used for pressing circuit contacts into place, completely useless as a weapon. She was aware of this. She walked across the street anyway. The lead soldier saw her coming and held up one hand. He said in Empire standard that this was a legal extraction under Thailic Resource Ordinance 47, and she should return to her business. She stopped in front of him. She looked at Peth, who had blood on his wrist from where someone had gripped him too hard. She looked at the grandchildren in the doorway. She looked back at the soldier. She said, "He is my neighbor. You are hurting my neighbor." The soldier said, "This does not involve you." She said, "He is my neighbor. That makes it involve me." The soldier looked at her the way large powers look at small objections, like weather, annoying but temporary. He told his men to keep moving. Noah did not move out of the way. What happened next was not heroic. She was not a fighter. She got shoved into the street and one of the soldiers put a hand on her collar and told her to stay down, and she got up again, and the other 2 had to hold her while the first one finished removing Peth from his home. She did not win anything in that moment. She did not stop it. Peth ended up sitting on the street with his small bag of belongings while his house was sealed with an extraction order sticker on the door. But when they left, she was still standing. And every Durath person on that street had watched a human stand up and keep standing up even after being knocked down. For a neighbor, for an old man, she had no political or military reason to protect. One of Peth's grandchildren, a small girl who could not have been older than 6, came out from the doorway. She crossed the street slowly. She took Noah's hand. Noah sat down on the street curb with her and did not say anything. She just sat there. That evening she sent a message through the human communication relay. She was not an official. She had no authority. She just wrote what she had seen, what had happened, the name of the street, the name of the old man, the names of his grandchildren as best as she could spell them. She did not know if anyone important would read it. She just knew that if no one said it, it would be as if it had not happened. And it had happened. Peth was real. His home was real. The grandchildren were real. She sent the message and went back into her shop and finished fixing the atmospheric processor, because the family who needed it also needed it to work, and they had already waited long enough. Nobody sent her a reply that night. But the message arrived. They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. On the human colony world of Marsh Station, 31 light-years from Dur-Athroman 4, a woman named Counselor Priya received Noah's message at midday and read it twice before she put it down. Priya was not the kind of person who read field reports twice. She had been in human colonial governance for 22 years. She had read thousands of reports. Most of them she could absorb in one pass and categorize and route and move on. She read Noah's message twice because the second time she was not reading for information. She was reading for the feeling underneath the words, the particular weight of someone who has just watched something happen and refuses to pretend it did not. She had felt that weight before. She knew what it meant when it came from someone like Noah, not a politician, not a soldier, a repair technician who got up off the street because an old man needed someone to stand between him and something wrong. She forwarded the message to 6 people. All of them were human. All of them worked in different parts of the colonial network. None of them had any formal connection to each other, except that Priya trusted every one of them to read a message like this and understand it the same way she did. 2 of them replied within the hour. One said, "How long has this been going on?" The other said, "I have 3 similar reports from other Thalic-controlled worlds in the last 4 months. I was waiting to see if it was a pattern." It was a pattern. Over the next week, Priya pulled everything she could find on the Thalic resource extraction program. What she found was not surprising in its existence. Old empires all ran versions of the same program. What was surprising was the scale and the speed. The Thalic were accelerating. What had previously been slow administrative pressure on local populations had shifted in the last year to direct forced removal. Faster timelines, less paperwork, less pretense. She could see why. 3 new mineral deposits had been identified in the territories under administrative guidance. The Thalic economy was under strain from a rival empire at their other border, and they needed the resource income faster than their previous pace allowed. They were cutting corners on the parts of their operation that they had always believed did not matter: the local populations, the small protests, the occasional alien observer who filed a complaint that no one important ever read. On day 9, a second message came from Dur-Athroman 4, not from Noah, from a Durath local community organizer named Fail, who had gotten Noah's contact information from someone at the relay station. Fail said, 14 more families received vacate orders this week. An elderly man tried to go back to his sealed house to get medicine he had left inside. The soldiers broke 2 of his fingers. Priya put that report in a different file. A file she had started years ago but had never used. She called it the line file in her own head. It was where she put the things that crossed a line she had been trying to be patient about. The fingers crossed the line. She was not a military person. She had never given a combat order in her life. She did not reach for anything violent. She reached for the one tool that humans had been quietly building for 2 centuries, and which most of the galaxy had either missed or dismissed. She started making calls. The first was to a human engineering consortium that had active operations in 4 Thalic-adjacent systems. She did not tell them what to do. She explained the situation and asked what they thought. The consortium director listened and then said, "We have been looking for a reason to decline the Thalic infrastructure contract renewal next quarter. This is a good reason." The second call was to the head of a Durath cultural foundation that humans had been quietly funding for 11 years. A small thing. Language preservation programs, local art archives, educational materials. The foundation head had worked with Durath communities for 15 years, and she had relationships that no political office had ever built. She said, "I know people on 8 Thalic worlds. I will start making calls tonight." The third call was the most interesting one. Priya called a retired Thalic official named Vor, who had served in their Foreign Relations Bureau for 30 years, before retiring to a small world at the edge of Empire space. They had met once at a trade conference 8 years ago and stayed in occasional contact, because they were both curious about how the other side thought. Priya said, "Vor, I need you to tell me honestly what the Thalic High Table will do if they start receiving formal pressure from the colonial network over the Durath situation." Vor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They will dismiss it. They always dismiss human complaints. You have been making them for years and nothing has ever come of it because you always stop short." Priya said, "What if we do not stop short this time?" Another silence, longer this time. Vor said, "Then I would suggest you move quickly, because once they realize you are serious, the first thing they will do is make the situation worse before anyone can document it properly. They have done it before. Create facts on the ground fast enough that any response looks like overreaction." Priya said, "Thank you, that is very helpful." She ended the call and sat for a moment. Then she sent a message to Noah on Durath Roman 4. She said, "Stay close to Peth and his family. Document everything you see. Get it to us as fast as you can. You are not alone in this." Noah replied 4 hours later. She said, "I know, I just needed someone else to say it." On Durath Roman 4, 3 streets over from the sealed house, Peth was sleeping on a mat in a neighbor's back room. His granddaughter was asleep beside him. She was holding his hand even in sleep, the way small children hold things they are afraid of losing. Nobody in the Thalic Empire knew any of this was happening yet. They were still looking at the human colonial network the same way they always had: small, scattered, emotional, slow. They were none of those things. They had just been patient. They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. The Thalic High Table received their first formal notice from the Human Colonial Council on a morning when 3 of the 7 table members were in a budget meeting, and 2 more were attending a state function for a visiting trade delegation. It was not treated as urgent. It was stamped, logged, and routed to the Foreign Affairs desk, where a junior clerk summarized it in 4 lines and attached it to the weekly digest. The summary said, "Human Colonial Council has submitted a formal protest regarding resource extraction operations on Durath Roman 4. Requests review of displacement procedures. Standard diplomatic language. No teeth." The clerk had been working in Thalic Foreign Affairs for 4 years. He was efficient and he was accurate. The summary was correct. The message used standard diplomatic language. What the clerk could not summarize because he did not know how to read it was the specific quality of silence that surrounded the formal language. The careful blankness of it. The way it said everything politely and left no room for misunderstanding and asked for nothing that sounded threatening. In certain contexts, that kind of message means the sender is weak and hopping for scraps. In other contexts, it means the sender is already done deciding and is giving you one last chance to avoid what comes next. The clerk did not know the difference. His superiors did not explain it to him. The weekly digest was read briefly at the following table meeting, and a senior minister named Grath said, "Send a standard acknowledgement and schedule a review meeting for next quarter." No one disagreed. They moved on to the budget meeting. On Durath Roman 4, Noah had spent the last 12 days doing two things simultaneously. She fixed machines in the front half of her shop, and in the back half, every evening she wrote. She wrote everything she saw. She wrote about the families who had received vacate orders. She wrote about the new processing facility taking shape on the land where Peth Street used to be. She wrote about the Durath elder who had her door sealed, while her medical equipment was still inside, and who had to borrow a neighbor's medication for 3 days until someone found a way to get it out. She wrote about the children who had started sleeping in groups because they were afraid at night, and none of the adults knew how to explain what was happening in a way that made children less afraid. She sent the reports to Priya. Priya compiled them. Priya sent them to a network of 11 people across 4 species who had agreed to receive and hold, and if necessary release them. Among those 11 was a Durath journalist named Sen, who lived on a neutral media station 2 systems away. Sen had been trying to report on Thoic resource operations for 3 years and had been blocked, delayed, and twice threatened with loss of access credentials. She received Noah's compiled reports and read them in one sitting. Then she made a decision that her editor called reckless and her sources called overdue. She published, not on a Thoic-controlled platform, on an independent galactic news relay that broadcast to 48 systems and was read by beings who cared about that kind of thing. The piece was long. It had names. It had dates. It had Noah's descriptions of children sleeping in groups because they were afraid, and Peth's granddaughter holding his hand, and the old man's broken fingers. It had photographs that 3 different Durath locals had taken on personal devices and sent to Noah, and which Noah had sent to Priya, and which had now traveled 31 light-years to become evidence. The Thoic Communications Bureau issued a denial within 6 hours. They said the report was exaggerated, that extraction procedures followed all relevant guidelines, and that the affected populations had been given proper notice and compensation pathways. Sen published a follow-up piece the next day. It contained the actual notice documents that Peth and his neighbors had received. It contained the compensation offer, which was a number so small compared to what the land was worth that 3 different economic commentators called it a document of insult rather than a document of payment. The follow-up piece traveled farther than the first one. At the Galactic Council's independent oversight desk, a Gret Holly administrator named Weth added Durath Roman 4 to her active monitoring list. She was one person managing a list of 63 situations, and she had limited power to do anything directly. But she could document. She could ask questions. She could make certain that, when larger decisions got made, there was a record that this had been known. On Mars Station, Priya received word from 2 allied species. A small but well-organized Prithian traders collective said they had already quietly pulled 3 supply contracts from Thoic-adjacent ports. They did not want recognition for this. They just wanted Priya to know. The second message was from a Reth Cluster Community Council, who said they had been watching the Thoic move through the sector for 20 years, and they had been waiting for someone to decide to do something about it. They asked, "Is this the time?" Priya replied, "Yes." She did not say it dramatically. She said it the way someone says yes to a question they have been thinking about for a long time and have finally finished thinking about. Back on Durath Roman 4, Noah did not know about any of the pieces moving in the larger world. She knew her street. She knew Peth and Fail and the families on her block. She knew that every morning when she opened her shop, there were a few more Durath faces that looked at her differently than before. Not with hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something that had not had a name before and was now beginning to find one. She fixed a broken water pump for a family 3 streets over that afternoon. She did not charge them. The daughter of the house, about 10 years old, watched her work the whole time without saying anything. When Noah finished and stood up, the girl said, "Are your people coming?" Noah said, "Some of them are already here." The girl thought about that, then she went inside. Noah picked up her tools and walked home in the early dark. They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. Senior Minister Grath of the Thalek High Table was a careful man. He had survived 6 different administrations by being careful. He did not react quickly. He did not say things publicly that he had not already said privately 3 times to test how they sounded. He was the kind of person who turned risks over slowly in his hands before deciding what to do with them. He was turning this one over on the 42nd day after the Durath Roman 4 report had first crossed his desk, and he was beginning to feel, in a way he did not like, that he had held it too long. The news pieces had been manageable at first. He had seen alien media make noise about Thalek operations before. It always faded. The galactic attention span for the suffering of small populations on unimportant worlds was short. That was not a cynical observation. It was just true. He had counted on it being true again. But this one was not fading. It had been picked up by 7 secondary outlets in the first week. Then 14 more. The photographs of Peth with the blood on his wrist, which Noah had taken on a small personal device, and which were not professionally shot or particularly dramatic, were somehow the most circulated image on 3 major galactic feeds. Something about them, the ordinariness of the man, the look on his face that was not angry and not afraid and was somehow worse than both. His communications bureau had issued 4 separate responses now, each one technically accurate, each one landing badly because the Durath community organizer Fail kept releasing more documents, more records, more names, and the humans kept helping him do it faster than the bureau could respond. That was the part Grath had not accounted for, not the noise, the speed. The human network moved information at a pace that felt personal, not like an institution circulating reports, like people telling other people something they were upset about. It spread the way anger spread among beings who knew each other. He called his foreign intelligence head into his office and asked for a full assessment of the human colonial network's actual capabilities. Not the diplomatic profile, the real one. The intelligence head, a female named Seth, came in with a data pad and an expression Grath did not like. She said, "We have been somewhat incomplete in our assessments of this." He said, "Explain somewhat incomplete." She said, "We have been tracking human military assets, ship counts, weapon systems, fleet deployments. Those numbers we have reasonably well. What we have not tracked systematically is their non-military infrastructure. Their communication relays alone cover more systems than our own internal network. Their medical teams have active presence on worlds in 4 different empires, including 2 of our own border territories. Their cultural and educational programs have been operating on 46 non-human worlds for over a decade, and in several cases, the local populations trust them more than they trust us." He said, "How many of those populations could be considered allied to humans if a conflict began?" She said, "We do not have a reliable number because we have never needed to count it before, but my estimate is more than we would want." He asked about the engineering contracts. She said, 17 have been canceled or not renewed in the last 30 days. 3 more are flagged as a trisk. The companies involved have all given standard business reasons. None of them have said anything political publicly, but the timing pattern is not random. He asked about the Verith Cluster Community Council. She looked at him carefully and asked how he knew about that. He said he had his own sources. She said, "The Verith Cluster has 14 armed vessels that they use for border security. Individually, they are not significant, but we have intelligence suggesting they are in active communication with human colonial command." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What would it take to make this stop? The noise, the publishing, the organizing, if we moved against the human operation on Durathroman 4 directly?" Seth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that Grath did not expect from his intelligence head. She said, "Sir, I would advise strongly against that. The humans have not moved any military assets yet. They are still operating entirely through information and relationships. If we move against their people on a world they are not even legally attached to, we change what this is." He said, "What does it become?" She said, "It becomes the thing they have been building toward for 200 years. Every bond they have made, every species they have helped, every quiet favor they have done over decades, it all becomes a reason. They will not need to convince anyone to help them. They will just need to ask." The room was quiet. Grath looked at the data pad she had left on his desk. The photograph of Peth was on the front page of the Galactic Council's public news summary. An old man on a street with a small bag and blood on his wrist and his house sealed behind him. He said, "Schedule an urgent communication with the Human Colonial Council, senior level. I want it formal and I want it within 48 hours." Seth said, "Yes, sir." She left. He sat alone and looked at the photograph for a while. He thought about Vor, his former colleague who had retired to the edge of Empire space. He had heard that Vor had been in contact with the humans recently. He had filed that piece of information away at the time. He pulled it back out now. He thought about what Vor would say if he called him. He thought that Vor would probably say, "I told you so." He thought that Vor would be right. He picked up his communication terminal and started drafting the message to the Human Colonial Council himself. He did not give it to his staff to draft. Some messages needed to sound like they came from a person and not an office. He wrote it carefully, the way he did everything. But for the first time in many years, he was not entirely sure it would be enough. They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. The meeting between Grath and Priya did not happen in a council chamber. It happened on a small neutral platform station called Verith Cross, which existed primarily as a refueling stop and had no political affiliation with anyone, because it had never been important enough for anyone to bother claiming it. It was the kind of place where the floors were always slightly sticky, and the food from the single vendor hall was technically edible, and everyone passing through was too tired from their journey to cause trouble. Grath brought 4 advisors. Priya brought 2. Her 2 were a trade specialist named Odal and Noah, whom she had specifically asked to make the journey from Durathroman 4. Grath saw Noah come in and looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise. He had read every report by now. He knew the repair shop. He knew the street. He knew she was the one who had walked across it. She was wearing the same kind of plain jacket she wore in Kethari. She looked like exactly what she was, a person who fixed things for a living. She sat down at the table and folded her hands and waited. Grath opened by saying the Thailic Empire recognized that the Durathroman 4 operations had caused disruption and harm to local communities, and that the High Table was prepared to discuss remediation. Priya said, "Remediation for Durathroman 4 specifically, or remediation for the program as a whole?" He said, "We are here to discuss Durathroman 4. She said, "Then we are going to have a short meeting and then a longer one later. We can do them in sequence today if you prefer. It would save travel time." He looked at her. She was not aggressive. She was not performing strength. She was simply stating what was true the way someone states what is true when they already know the outcome and are being efficient about reaching it. He asked what she meant by the program as a whole. She said, "Your resource extraction operations across 14 administered worlds. The displacement record going back 11 years. The labor agreements on 5 of those worlds that your own internal documents describe as involuntary. She slid a data pad across the table. She said, "We have the documents, not summaries, the documents themselves." The silence at the table changed quality. One of his advisors leaned toward him and said something quietly. Grath held up one hand. He looked at the data pad. He did not pick it up. He said, "Where did you get these?" Priya said, "People gave them to us. People who work inside your administration and who have been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." This was the part Grath had not seen coming. Not the military pressure, not the allied species, not the economic withdrawal. The inside. The quiet ones who had been watching and waiting inside the empire itself and who had decided, when they saw that humans were actually going to follow through, to send what they knew. He said, "This changes the nature of this conversation considerably." She said, "Yes. That is why I told you about it now rather than later." He said, "What do you want?" She said, "The same things we have always wanted. We wrote them in the formal notice 42 days ago. The displacement program stops. The families on Durath-Roman 4 and the other affected worlds go back to their homes or are compensated at actual market value by independent assessment. The labor agreements are dissolved and the workers are released. An independent body reviews your resource extraction contracts going forward." He said, "You understand what you are asking costs the empire significantly in economic terms." She said, "Yes, we understand. We also know you can afford it. We have looked at your budget." One of his advisors made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Priya continued. She said, "We are not trying to collapse your economy. We are not trying to take your territory or embarrass you publicly more than has already happened. We want the harm stopped. We want the people given back what was taken from them. That is the whole list." Grath said, "And if we agree to this?" She said, "Then we stop. The news cycle gets quieter. The contracts start coming back. The allied species communications go back to routine. Your Vor tells you we keep our word. You can ask him." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why does your word mean something?" It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one. He was a careful man and he wanted to understand the mechanism. Priya thought about it. She said, "Because we do not do this for leverage. We do not build relationships with other species so that we can call them in later for our own benefit. We build them because we think it matters that beings are treated well. When we spend political capital on Peth Street on Durath-Roman 4, it is not an investment we are expecting a return on. It is just what we think is right. That is not a strategy. It is a position." Grath looked at Noah. Noah had not said anything the entire meeting. He asked her directly, "You walked across the street for a man you had no political obligation to protect." She said, "He was my neighbor." He said, "That is all." She said, "That is usually how it starts." He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Priya and said, "I will need 3 days to bring this to the full table. I am not able to commit the empire to these terms alone." Priya said, 3 days is acceptable." He said, "If I bring this to the table and it is agreed, I want it on record that the agreement came through conversation and not coercion." She said, "We have no interest in recording it any other way." He nodded. He picked up the data pad finally and put it in his bag. He stood, and his advisor stood with him. At the door he stopped and looked back at Noah one more time. He said, "The man, Peth, is he well?" Noah said, "He is staying with neighbors. His granddaughter has not let go of his hand in about 3 weeks." Grath said nothing to that. He left. Outside the window of Verith Cross, the stars sat still and cold and patient in the dark the way they always did, indifferent to the small but permanent things being decided in sticky-floored rooms by tired beings who had traveled a long way to try to get something right. They broke the one rule: humans turned their empire to ash. The Thoic High Table agreed to the terms on day 2, not day 3. Grath presented it. 2 of the 7 members objected. 1 resigned in protest. The other 4 looked at the data pad with the internal documents and looked at the news feeds and looked at the engineering contract cancellation list and the Verith cluster communication intercepts, and they said yes. Not because they wanted to. Because Grath had walked them through the alternative carefully and honestly, and the alternative looked like the end of everything they had built over 3 centuries. The formal agreement was filed with the Galactic Council's oversight body the following morning. Weth, the Gret Holly administrator who had added Dureth Roman 4 to her monitoring list, received the filing and read it twice, and then sent a private message to a colleague that said simply, "The humans actually did it." The implementation was slow in some places and fast in others. The displacement program stopped almost immediately because that required only an order, and Grath gave the order himself. The labor agreements took 6 weeks to fully dissolve because there were beings on 5 worlds who needed somewhere to go and needed to be told properly that they were free and not just released into an unfamiliar situation with no support. Human logistics teams coordinated with Durath community networks to handle that part. Noah's contact fail organized most of it on Durath Roman 4 specifically. He was very good at it. Peth went home on day 9. The extraction order sticker was peeled off his door by a Thoic administrative officer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else and who said nothing. Peth unlocked the door himself with the key he had kept in his pocket every day since they sealed it. He went inside. His house was exactly as he had left it except dusty. His granddaughter walked through every room with him checking. Noah was standing outside. She had not been invited. She had just shown up because it seemed like the kind of moment that someone should witness. Peth came back to the doorway after a few minutes. He looked at her. He said something in his own dialect that her translation chip rendered as, "The walls are still mine." She said, "Yes, they are." He nodded. He went back inside. His granddaughter came to the doorway and looked at Noah. She was the same small girl who had crossed the street and taken Noah's hand on the day this all started. She said, "Are you going to stay?" Noah said, "For a while longer, yes." The girl said, "Good," and went inside. On Marsh Station, Priya filed the final compliance report and then did something she rarely did during working hours. She went outside. The station had a long observation deck that overlooked the planet below, a green and brown world with long coastlines and cloud cover moving slowly across the northern continent. She stood there for a while and let herself feel the particular kind of tired that comes not from effort but from the release of effort. The sustained holding of something very heavy for a very long time. Her colleague Odell found her out there after a few minutes. He stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "The Verith Cluster Council sent a message." She said, "What did it say?" He said, "It said thank you, and also that they have 3 other situations they would like to discuss with us when we have time." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. She said, "Of course they do." On the neutral media station, journalist Sen published one final piece. It was shorter than the others. It did not have photographs or documents or official filings. It was just the story of how it had started. A repair shop on a side street. An old man pulled from his home. A human woman who had walked across a street with a tool in her hand and no plan and no authority and no reason except that he was her neighbor. The piece was read by several million beings across 48 systems. The comments below it were the usual mixture of opinions and arguments and beings talking past each other. But scattered through them, in a dozen different languages and dialects and translationship approximations, were beings from worlds that Noah had never heard of saying versions of the same thing. "I have a neighbor like that. My people have a person like that." That is the kind of story we needed to read today. Noah did not read the article. She did not know about it until Priya forwarded it to her 3 weeks later with a message that said, "You should probably see this." She read it in the back of her shop on a slow afternoon, while a power converter was running diagnostics in the corner. She read it once. Then she put her terminal down and picked up her tools because someone was coming in at the next hour with a broken water recycler, and it was not going to fix itself. In the street outside her shop, Kethari was moving the way it always moved. Vendors calling, children running, a cargo vehicle rumbling past. The fabric merchant next door was arguing pleasantly with a customer about price. The purification supply store on the other side had a new sign in the window. The street looked almost the same as it had before. The difference was small. It was the kind of difference you could only see if you had been standing on it before and were standing on it now. The people walked a little differently, not faster or louder, just less carefully, like beings who were still watching out but had put down something they had been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. Noah looked at the street for a moment before her customer arrived. Then she went back inside and got to work.